Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Landmark, your go-to podcast for exploring the challenges and opportunities shaping the property and development industry. I'm your host, James Bailey, Managing Partner at Bruton Knowles. And today we're taking on one of the most crucial issues of our time, the care crisis in the UK. From underfunded systems and fluctuating policies to workforce challenges and the skyrocketing costs of care, these issues touch all corners of society. They impact not only individuals and families, but also the communities and infrastructure we work within every day. So in this episode, we'll delve into the roots of the care crisis and explore how it intersects with the property, planning, and community development. We'll discuss what's broken, what's working, and most importantly, how we can all work towards creating solutions that benefit everyone. Let's get started. I'd like to welcome Sam Spencer today.
Thank you, James. Pleased to be here.
And we're here to discuss social care, Sam, which is a topic that pops up continuously within our business, dealing with the social care sector. It's a big issue across the whole of society, and it's something that crops up in our private lives with elderly relatives, certainly in my case. Sam, do you want to give everybody just a bit of a background into your career related around social care?
Yes, thank you, James. I'm a chartered surveyor. I've been involved with trading property, as you know, for nearly 30 years. Started my career in that sector with Christie & Co, who cover care in a major way, care property, and that was my first introduction to the sector in terms of operational detail and property assets. Since I've been with Bruton Knowles, as you were aware when I joined, the firm had a lot of involvement in third sector, a lot of which revolved around care and still does. So we've pursued that experience and interest in terms of valuing and advising various clients on care property.
So I think before we kick off and lift the lid on social care, probably quite important for people listening to understand kind of how we arrived where we are. Bit of a scene setter really in terms of the current landscape around care provision in the UK, and probably since, the Second World War and the NHS being launched, what's changed really in social care? How we arrived where we are, Sam?
Well, it's interesting that the majority of commentary in mainstream media revolves around aged care, which has become a very hot topic. We constantly hear about bed blocking, hospitals, people can't get a bed for treatment because patients that are fit to leave can't because there isn't provision for them, accommodation for them to go to. And in that sense, the NHS is a victim of its own success. This was actually said to me a couple of weeks ago by a neighbour of mine who's a retired thoracic surgeon, so it's not just me saying it. But interestingly, I think the care landscape is much, much wider than that, and there's been a lot of press lately regarding cared for children, homelessness, younger adults who have various issues around learning difficulties, spectrum disorders, where care in the community policies have patently not worked. The crisis sort of stems through the age groups really, in terms of the problems that are now being felt by people.
That's a good point you make there, Sam. I think care goes across a whole range of age groups and needs, definitely. And I think it's much broader than people actually think. I think also we need to shine a light on government funding, which is the major issue possibly behind where we find ourselves today. But I think as we unravel and unpick this conversation in this podcast, this has been going on for a very long time. We find ourselves where we are now, but it's a long-term approach to care, and this is government funding that's gone across different governments over different periods of time. And certainly when I've looked at this, you do realise that in terms of real changes in policy and real commitments to increasing funding, that's not actually happened for about 40 to 45 years, despite white papers and reviews and changes of governments and commitments and people standing up in the House of Commons and making grand speeches. The truth is that government funding hasn't shifted significantly over that period.
No, I think you're exactly right. The problem stems, again, if we look at the establishment of the NHS, then the contingent problems have got worse since then, and the underlying issue is probably lack of joined-up thinking. The unintended consequence of the NHS's broad success is that people are living longer, which is probably the major issue that seems to get the press, but also many more people require care than would have done in the past. But there's been no specific thought given to how the extra care that is needed, or is continually needed, is provided. Lack of government funding is a very good place to start. I think the issues are really quite fundamental in that we can all pay more tax, but the tax revenue doesn't necessarily go where we're promised it would. Certain politicians might make a particular stand on care funding and suggest policies that we could implement if there was more money to do it, but when they actually get into power, the Treasury takes over and different demands are made on tax income that aren't necessarily the ones we thought we were voting for. It's a particular beef of mine, as you know. I think politicians with a small p have been massively dishonest over a long period of time about the true costs of providing care to people who can't afford it, which is the majority of the population in truth. But that, of course, completely exacerbated by political instability, because every 5 years, generally speaking, there's a general election. You're probably not very happy with the current government, so you vote for a different one who changed the landscape, changed the spending priorities. So there's no long-term thought applied to how we address all the interlocking issues of the NHS and social care and the cost of the success of the NHS, because there is a cost to it, and how we just look after people.
I think you're right, Sam. It's interesting that affordability is at the heart of this, whether it's at governmental level or individual level. The care requirements are increasing as people live longer. People have to make a greater provision for that care. As we know, quite a lot of care is done by families still, so they don't burden the state, as it were. It's dealt with within family groups, but that burden is becoming more challenging, I think, as we move forward for more families in the UK, given the cost of living and all the other factors that people have to cope with. Crisis is probably the right word. I don't think it's too strong a word to use, because that seems to be what people are saying around care in the UK, that it has reached a crisis point. I think probably for what we need to do for the benefit of the listeners is just look at those key issues. That why are we saying things are in crisis? Well, perhaps if we have a look at the key issues that are impacting the care sector. Clearly one is the cost of resourcing and staffing facilities. As we know in the UK, and we've discussed this in other podcasts, we are blessed at the moment in the UK with difficulties around resourcing, particularly at lower wage levels, which the care sector is a good example of, one that is fairly highly staffed with people who are working hard, working long hours in a challenging environment, but being paid surprisingly little for doing that.
I think you're absolutely right, yeah. A lot of carers who are actually caring for people day to day, hour to hour, are paid minimum wage and doing a job that many people wouldn't consider doing, to be fair. They come in for a huge amount of criticism, and unfortunately, particularly in the private sector, the people that employ the carers can't afford to pay them any more than that. There's a lot of bad information in mainstream media about profits that care providers make, and whilst undoubtedly some do make quite a lot of money, a lot of smaller private care homes don't actually make a lot of money. Wages has become a massive problem, not helped by recent changes in tax policy for employers, but equally not helped by previous government policies which resulted in a lot of the people who are employed in the care business have gone back to their own countries because they were made to feel unwelcome here. So it's a sort of catalogue of errors, political errors along the way that have contributed to where we are now in terms of wages particularly, but numbers of people who are available to work and willing to work, which I think is a crucial issue.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because people that are paid for doing a care job are paid not particularly well. And also, if we think about the family environment, there's lots of carers out there that are not paid at all, that are people looking after elderly relatives or people with dementia that, quite frankly, the government, they just fall under the radar because they're in a family environment or a family group and they're assisting. So there seems to be something around caring for people that isn't recognised within our society as having a value. And that value is the real issue, because people think that, from a society point of view, we as a nation don't put a high enough value on that to reward people that are doing, think of adult care, think of learning difficulty care, think of aged care. These are real skilled roles, particularly with children, to develop young people into, as you said, children that have had difficult starts in life and, for no fault of their own, find themselves within the care sector. We have a responsibility as a society to do our best by them. And that is about trying to, as we would all like to aspire to, having best-in-class care. But the reality is, as a nation, I don't think we're prepared to pay for it. Clearly, we're not prepared to pay for it, because we look at care, and we'll come on to other factors within care that all scream a massive lack of funding.
That's right. It's true. But I think your point about not being prepared to pay for it may be valid to a degree, but I'm not sure that people generally are aware
of the actual costs. The real costs.
The real cost of caring in all the sectors you mentioned, in all the segments and age groups you mentioned, would be if they knew the truth. And then to suggest that lack of government funding is responsible for that is not entirely fair, because I think the government can only fund what government receives. So perhaps lack of honesty about the true cost and the true tax burden that's required would be a better way to look at it. I mean, in Scandinavia, for example, the tax burden's significantly higher than here, the personal income tax burden. The quality of care is much better. And your point about family care, well, let's sort of look at Spain and Italy. A significantly larger amount or number of older people still cohabit with their children, who are now grown up, obviously, but they're looked after at home. And I think that those numbers speak for themselves. So your point about attitudes towards it is probably very valid. And do we need to completely change our mindset about how we want to look after people that need looking after? It's not just about the money.
Let's touch upon something that I know you want to touch upon, Sam, which is the Care Quality Commission, which, for those listening, the description of it on Google is: the Care Quality Commission is an executive, non-departmental public body sponsored by the Department of Health and Social Care, which I think is really interesting. There's a couple of interesting words there for me, is non-departmental and sponsored by. So I think that's a perfect opener to what is the Care Quality Commission, Sam?
The non-departmental thing's quite interesting, isn't it? Because shouldn't it have oversight from the Department of Health? The Care Quality Commission is an agency, if you like, of government, don't care whether it's non-departmental or not, which is tasked with inspecting, rating and overseeing care provision or care providers and the settings in which the provision is given. That covers care homes, doctor surgeries, hospitals, dental surgeries and various other things. My own experience of it within the aged care sector is that certainly since the COVID pandemic, it has become incredibly inefficient. I've valued homes, as you know, for a couple of clients where they've acquired a home with, for instance, a requires improvement rating, gone in there, sorted the home out, made it good, improved the facility, improved the level of care being given, and not had a re-inspection from CQC for 3 years. So trying to generate more business through the home with a requires improvement rating which is clearly inaccurate. So why is it in the position where care homes particularly aren't being inspected when they've transferred ownership? I've also had anecdotally seen comments from other property experts in the sector who've made the same comments about new care homes which have been built and opened and not inspected for 2 to 3 years, which is clearly unacceptable. how can people make a rational decision about whether to send or to accommodate mum or dad or whoever it is they need to accommodate in a care home which hasn't got a rating? How do they know it's good unless it's got the official sort of stamp of approval? I also think that as far as CQC is concerned, they seem to have to cover an awful lot of different segments of the market, and maybe therefore there should be different agencies to say look after GP practices rather than the Care Quality Commission, because the provision of care is completely different in those than it is from care homes. The inefficiencies in the CQC seem to be systemic at the moment, and it needs sorting out.
It's interesting when people need to, for the first time, turn to the care sector for, like you say, provision for an elderly relative perhaps. It's very daunting because people don't actually know an awful lot about the care system or the care process, and their only interface is at that point when there's a family crisis and something has to happen. So presumably that rating system that they provide, the Care Quality Commission, enables people to make an initial sift of care homes in their area by the quality rating that they get. But as you say, if that system isn't complete, then you're not armed with the right information.
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, there's a very good website called carehome.co.uk, which I think is subscribed to by care providers. So obviously not all the care businesses are going to be on there, but they also have a rating system which is based on customer reviews, for want of a better expression. I actually find that when I'm doing valuations, care homes, I find that very useful, because when a home is on there, carehome.co.uk do actually put the CQC report on as well, or a link to it. You have this bizarre situation sometimes, which is quite random, where a home will have customer reviews of 9.8 out of 10 and a not very good CQC review, and then you look at the dates and you realise why a lot of the time.
It's out of date.
If you know what you're looking at. So I think in terms of consumer looking for a care provider, that would probably be as good a one as to look at as the CQC. But it is wrong that CQC are so far behind the curve with their ratings, because it not only might convince a likely user not to go there wrongly, but it's also not fair on the providers if the rating's been improved, or if it's not the same provider as was rated at the time, and that can have bad effects on the business.
Yeah, to not recognise those improvements, I think, is poor, isn't it? And I think when people need to make a choice, it's a very stressful time anyway. So the more quality information people have, it's not the only information, obviously, but really, the more information, the better information, the easier it is to make that difficult decision. I think moving on from the CQC, let's touch upon affordability of care for the public. And we've already hinted at escalating costs and diminishing savings to fund care. But one of the issues, Sam, I mean, do you think people really understand the cost of care, the actual cost of caring for people in the United Kingdom in 2025?
No, I don't think they do, because they don't look at it as a potential outgoing for the future. The problem we've got is with the narrative. It's a bit like, it sounds very stark, it's a bit like talking about death. Nobody likes to talk about it, but it happens to everybody. And I think in this country particularly, there's been a shift from co-living in terms of looking after elderly parents in the domestic environment towards aged care. I think that equally nobody really wants to talk about that. We do have this sort of habit in the UK of increasingly buying a sort of bigger house and waiting for that to improve in value to fund our retirement. Well, some people and then you get to a certain age, you don't need the house, you sell the house, you've got pots of money. Well, that's clearly not a model that works anymore. And equally, government have set the limit of savings before you have to pay for care at just over £23,000, which is just not anything like much money in terms of savings these days. And it seems deeply unfair if somebody's paid taxes for their entire life and managed to save a pot of money, that when they get to the stage where they need care, they have to spend it all on care home fees. So our entire mindset, I think, as a nation has to change, and it has to change with the public. And that change has to start with government, because we talk about government funding, but government only gets its money from tax income. So government being honest about the true cost of care and telling the electorate, this is the true cost, and then saying to the electorate, are we going to pay for this? Are we going to accept that we need to cover this cost or not? Because without that honest conversation and complete change of mindset, nothing's going to happen. And we're going to come up against, as somebody we were talking to recently said, a cliff edge, and lots of things are going to tip off the cliff edge. I think we need to change the narrative completely about care. And if I can just sort of digress for a second, it's the same in the cared for children sector, where the cost of caring for children that require domestic care is huge. We all, anybody who's got or had children knows how much it costs to bring up children. Yet, when cared for children are in an environment where they've probably been abused physically and or mentally and are living in a home which is not their own, or it becomes their own. And for the benefit of listeners who aren't aware, the children's home sector has changed so that the vast majority of cared for children live in an environment of 3 to 4 children at most with adult carers. But the cost of that is huge. And yet, because some Tory or other complained about it 4 or 5 years ago, it instituted a Competition and Markets Authority review of the sector because they said the childcare provider was making too much money, which is clearly ridiculous when government with a small g has completely abrogated its responsibility for that type of childcare years ago to the private sector. You can't sort of give it away and then complain about the cost, I'm afraid. And that seems to be what's happening right through the sector from all age groups. And it's just wrong. So we need to change our mindset about care that people of all ages need when they need it. And we need to be honest with ourselves, and the politicians need to be honest with us about what that's going to cost.
And I think also, looking at escalating costs, the cost of care provision must continue to increase simply because all the other costs that go into care are increasing. The cost of living crisis that's been experienced, it's not going to get cheaper. Having an honest conversation with everybody about care is something that is probably long overdue.
Almost definitely, yeah.
Probably going to be a brave politician that does it, but the reality is, cliff edge is probably a strong word, but for those people that are in the care sector working in it, or like you do, deal with it probably isn't. I think people can see it over a time where it's incredibly challenging, particularly from a property perspective, because, standards have to increase, buildings have obsolescence in them, and the care sector has to increasingly provide new stock to cope with people, and it's expensive. Cost of borrowing is going up, cost of materials is going up, so the actual cost of land, delivering of the building, all of these things have to be factored in, which is why ultimately a private operator needs to make a return on that investment. Otherwise, it's up to government to build care homes and care facilities that then can be used by everybody in the UK. So it's a clear choice, and there's only probably 2 choices. Government either comes to the forefront and takes the lead in doing it themselves, or, as you say, aggregates responsibility to the private sector within guidelines, but then you have to expect operators to seek a return. It's like that. It is like the argument that sort of flies around about house builders. Everybody moans about house builders and how much money they make. Yeah, but they're really good at building new houses, and most new built houses, they take 10 years from when someone first looks at a piece of land to go all the way through the promoting it, planning, designing it, constructing it, the fact that they're efficient in how they build it, etc. People have to be careful what they wish for, but a lot of it's based on pure ignorance, that they just don't understand all of the costs that go into the delivery at the end. And I think an honest conversation around that is something that would, clearly be a good thing, so people can understand more about why care costs what it costs.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we've probably focused rather on aged care here, but we do need to be honest about our attitudes towards homelessness and reducing that for the people who are homeless, and increasing care for younger adults with learning difficulties, spectrum disorders and what have you, who need support and need care, and we need to provide accommodation for them as well. And they're not in a position perhaps where they can rely on, or they definitely won't be in a position where they can rely on savings or family to help them out. So it's a much broader issue and a much bigger problem than probably a lot of people realise. I have to say I'm encouraged by the current Health Secretary because he is changing the narrative about certainly the NHS, and somebody's got to do that. Whether he'll be able to source the funding necessary to make the improvements that he wants to make in his first term, he might not get another term either, which is part of the problem we face, isn't it, with the whole discussion. But at least he has had the audacity to throw some challenges out in terms of how care is provided. So with a bit of luck, if that continues, then the narrative could change. But it does need to change. And I think that any politician that's got enough about them to go for the change of narrative should be supported full, regardless of which party they're from or what ideology they propose. They should be supported by the public.
Yeah, and it needs a few champions, doesn't it, that can then get it up the Treasury hierarchy in terms of its importance. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
Shall we just touch on, really, for the listeners' benefit, Bruton's relationship with the care sector? So what, the connection or the link between property consultancy, which we undertake, and the care sector, and our observations around the difficulties that are within it. So obviously, as a practice, we deal with land development, construction monitoring through our building consultancy team. We acquire land for care home facilities, and then we have yourself who values and advises people in terms of care facilities. So what are we seeing as a practice in terms of, I suppose, the difficulties around delivery of care building or care property?
Most of my work in the sector, as you know, is based on valuations for lenders, particularly. I think the encouraging thing that I've noted in the last 18 months to 2 years is the increasing number of lenders who are prepared to consider the sector as a suitable place for 10-year loan terms, for example. And the majority of all the lenders actually who are willing to lend in the care sector are very happy to lend to good care outlets. I think some of the biggest challenges are for those outlets which could be rehabilitated and retained in care, finding the funding to do that. The operators that want to do that need to have a robust business plan, which makes it difficult for first-time entrants into the sector. If it's a new project, equally, we're in a position where we can provide advice based on asset values to our third sector clients at whichever part of the sector they're involved with, whether that's adult social care, aged care, child care. We do have the oversight to be able to comment about viability of projects, for example. It's a moving market, though. It's probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah, certainly for our charity sector clients, professionally, we've been involved in relocation or redevelopment of older sites with new facilities being built and come across the sort of the classic issues around planning and the general public, or certainly people in the closer vicinity, not being particularly supportive of these facilities and raising lots of objections around why these developments should take place. So there's lots of issues around the development of new built stock for particularly the charity sector, because funding is always critical, always tight for charity clients. But it's worth saying that within the care sector, of course, there's an awful lot of charities that are providing the care. It isn't a private sector operator, and it's not government. It's charitable organisations that raise funds, like all charities do, and then deliver care facilities. And you and I visited a number of those with Leonard Cheshire as one of our clients, where we've helped them over a number of years, coming out of older buildings into more modern, dedicated facilities. But a great caring organisation, caring for people with physical and mental disabilities, but in the cold light of day receiving not a lot of government support at all. Certainly not for the planning system, certainly not through any funding that would help them build the building. So there's a whole raft of issues around future deliverability, but again, government really taking a back seat.
Well, I think For aged care facilities, probably not so much of a problem, but the one sector where I particularly find difficulties for developers and operators is adult social care and social housing. Just the backlash on any proposed scheme, and you find it. So a lot of new residential developments have an affordable housing allocation which they need to meet, and the number of developers that use expensive lawyers and planning consultants to get out of that commitment it's just...
or significantly diminish the numbers that are required on a site, yes.
And the numbers are there because they're required. It's not to tick a box for some
It's because
idealist.
there's been an identified need.
There is a massive, massive need in this country for social housing, supported or otherwise, which, I bring into the care sector, because if people haven't got a nice place to live, they can't care for themselves. So somebody else has got to. And talking to one of our clients recently who look after homeless people, he made the point quite robustly that they've got to get homeless people into an environment where they're no longer homeless, even if it's a room in a hostel. They can begin to support those people and probably move them into some form of supported living arrangement, and eventually into some form of proper dwelling on their own. That brings that person from significant risk to their health, sleeping on the streets, to actually probably being able to contribute back to society and feeling good about that. And that's another narrative that we don't want to talk. Nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah, and it's quite frightening when you think of the number of homeless people that have served in our armed forces. The percentage of people it's always surprises me that it's such a high number, that people have joined the army, the navy, or the air force, and some of them gone abroad and fought for us as a nation and all that sort of thing, and then you end up sleeping under a railway tunnel in a city. You think, crikey. This is the bit where you can be Prime Minister for a day, Sam. What do we think really needs to happen in terms of what policy? So government is in play to safeguard on behalf of the citizens of the UK. What we've seen over the last 40 to 45 years is what I would best describe as kicking the can down the road. So it's somebody else's problem. It'll get sorted in the next parliament or after the next election or with the next government. And we've seen that in play with Labour, with the Conservatives and with the coalition government. So they're all tarred with the same brush. So let's just step aside. Prime Minister for the day, what policy recommendations do we think we could come up with that would really help to reshape not just sort of government's relationship with the care sector, but also the wider societal piece as well? What do we think?
Well, I think policy is difficult to sort of just reel off, because we've got to change the way we think about it. We need to rediscover kindness and empathy for those people who are less fortunate than us. Starts with education. We need to stop looking at the homeless person on the street, with distaste and disgust, and perhaps just take a moment to think, why are they there? Why are they in that situation? Moving sort of through the various parts of it, not think, the children in that house are all delinquents. They're there because they've been abandoned by their parents, or they've abandoned themselves with their parents because of some physical or mental trauma, and then not sit there and wonder why, or not assume that somebody in a new social housing scheme sort of just down the road from you are going to all be awful people, because of course the vast majority of them won't. They just can't afford what we can afford. And then when it comes to aged care, that needs to be driven, the provision of aged care needs to be driven by Department of Health in conjunction with care providers to work out the solution, particularly for people who don't need to be in a hospital but probably need some form of care and support to be able to afford to be in a home. Now, whether we pay for that as taxpayers because those people haven't got any money, or whether we pay for it because we can afford it because it's our mum and dad, it comes back to honesty. And I don't think we can set any policy until actually we all sit around and go, yeah, you know what, we need to change the way we think about this.
I think it's evident from kind of looking at, well, certainly the recent history of the last 50 years, is that policy funding would be something to look at, because there's an awful lot of funding now that distills down from central government into local government by what I would describe as ad hoc bidding processes. There is no clear mainstream funding. It's there's a point of need, certainly at local authority level. There's you can bid, and on a year by year basis you'll get different amounts depending on how successful you bid or how successful somebody else bids. But it's not consistent, it's not clear, and there isn't a genuine, what I would describe as commitment, because I think what you're steering towards is two things, which is government has to be very clear about the commitment to care by putting it much higher up the hierarchy in terms of Treasury spend, and then matching that with a commitment through the Treasury, but explaining why that commitment's there. And Boris Johnson, I think, tried it at one point, but that's Boris Johnson. It kind of came in with a levy through national insurance, and then a year later, Kwasi Kwarteng has cancelled it in his 2022 budget. So a good example of politicians just getting it wrong, because taking a good idea but then just not seeing it through over a sustained period in a very, very clear way. So I think a policy commitment around funding is very, very clear. A wider discussion is required. But again, when you look at the recent history, there has been commissions, there has been white papers, there's been green papers, there's been discussions, but that's all they are.
All of which have been ignored.
Yeah, none of them have been actioned. And the reality behind that is it's time to step on to the next stage. You've got to deliver something that's tangible, because to do nothing is not an option.
No. Well, it comes back to the point I made about honesty, and stop making promises that you're not going to keep. You'd be better off just keeping your mouth shut and just not saying anything. Deeply annoying.
Yeah, well, in modern politics, I'm afraid there, Sam, I don't think you're going to cure that. But I certainly think around blame culture, you're right. I think there is a tendency in society to blame certain types of people, regardless of whether we've got any knowledge of who they are, what their circumstances are, which is, I think, played out in the mainstream media quite clearly, that, you can vilify certain people. If you're homeless, then you're homeless and you deserve to be. Well, we have to change that conversation, because, being empathetic and there's a clue in the word, care. We have to draw that out much more as a society, because it goes across all age groups.
Well, it's very interesting talking to the people that provide the care a lot of the time. And I find it more noticeable with targets for vilification, if you like. So, the cared for children sector and the homeless sector. But the people providing the care, the vast majority of them, they're just brilliant. They're just brilliant. They do a job that actually a lot of us would find very difficult to do, with the level of empathy they give and the kindness. And I come back to that kindness and empathy. We need to have a rethink. That's where it's got to start from that.
I think you're right. I think that certainly there's a lot of jobs in care that you wouldn't want to do and you couldn't do. And I think we have to recognise the people that are doing it need to be not just rewarded, but recognised for doing it.
Celebrated.
Celebrated. That's a good way of putting it, because that's really how you get the agenda going upwards, so people are thinking about it more. But I think the reality is that with a lot of care scenarios, people don't actually think about them until there's a crisis, which is kind of not the greatest way to do anything, is it?
No.
We need to be more open as a society about discussing care plans, because people are living into their 80s and the 90s. It has to be more within family groups, a discussion around, and acceptance, really, I suppose, that you are going to have to spend money, just like, young children go to nursery, and families that want children, have children, you understand that that's your commitment, that, you have to pay £1,000 a month to put your children into nursery. That conversation doesn't quite play out the same way when it's an aged relative who sold a house and they've got funds, they've still got a house and they've got assets. It's if they're going to live a long time, families are just going to have to accept that perhaps that inheritance isn't going to come their way, because it's going to care for that person because they're going to live into their 90s. It's a societal thing.
And it's their money.
And it is their money, yeah. And really, it is about, and I use the word again, care, as my own mother-in-law is unfortunately suffering from dementia and is in a care facility, which is, for her, a fantastic place to be, because she's being cared for in a way that we, in the end, as a family, couldn't care for.
No, that's exactly right. But, it's a perfectly good example of the point I was making, in that is that those people are specialised. They care, they know what they're doing and provide the care that is geared entirely to your mother-in-law, and know what they're doing, and that's why they get paid what they get paid.
For From a client's point of view, Sam, let's just think about someone that approaches us and wants professional advice to get into the care sector. Buy a piece of land, build a building, and effectively deliver care services. I suppose really what advice would we give them in terms of the ease of difficulty of that? Is it a good sector to be in? What's your thoughts on that?
Interesting question. Aged Care ONS said yesterday that they're expecting the number of pensioners to increase by 1.7 million in the next 8 years. So there will undoubtedly remain tremendous demand for beds in aged care facilities. The majority of developer operators in that sector are fairly well provided for. A lot of new residential developments have a plot for a care home. Unless the potential investor was familiar with care, I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to go into it on a fully operational basis without a lot of help. Probably a team behind you that's already qualified to do that. The sectors where I'm encountering most of the development are adult social care, social housing, cared for children. Those sectors particularly where a lot of the new developments are being undertaken by developer investors, but then being let on reasonably good terms to social housing providers or care providers. The majority of, certainly some of the social housing providers that I've worked with will take 15 or 20 year leases on a full repair and insuring basis. So the covenants are very good. So if you're a developer and want to retain the asset for investment purposes, then not a bad way to go. The demand in those sectors equally is increasing in terms of requirement. So as long as we know who the provider is and what the covenant is, that's not a bad recommendation.
Yeah, sounds like it. Take advice and get your ducks in line by the sounds of it. But I think you're right that the overall outlook is for long-term need, isn't it? So that there is potential for, I suppose, new entrants. But yeah, you have to know the market, clearly.
But the demand isn't going to go away. It's only going to get greater.
Thanks for that, Sam. That's been an extremely interesting discussion. And I think we will certainly return to care and social care at some point because it's such a big topic and impacts, well, all of us. So not just in a professional capacity at Bruton Knowles, but in our personal lives as well. So thanks for your time.
Pleasure.
That brings us to the end of this episode of Landmark. Thank you for joining me as we unpack the complexities of the UK care crisis and explored the ways in which it intersects with our work in property, infrastructure and community development. At Bruton Knowles, we remain focused on delivering value through forward-thinking solutions and staying ahead of the challenges facing our clients and communities. As we continue into 2025, our commitment is to help drive innovation, advocate for sustainable development, and contribute meaningfully to shaping a more resilient future. If you have questions, feedback, or ideas for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. Feel free to reach out to us directly through our website or social channels for more information on how Bruton Knowles can support your goals. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the next episode of Landmark.